Zeke Miller is in Washington. He's a CBSN political contributor and political reporter for Time. Zeke, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with foreign policy. The president indicated that he was moved by the images coming out of Syria and that his attitude towards Assad has changed very much. Given the president's America First doctrine, how has the president's position on Syria evolved?
You know, we didn't hear a lot about Syria from the president during the campaign, other than just taking pot shots at the Obama administration over the red line policy. And certainly in the first two and a half months of this young administration, the message from the White House has sort of been, you know, you, Assad, do your own thing. And then even though in the last week, the White House sort of formalized that, saying that accepting the Assad regime was a political reality. And the timing of that was interesting, because that came just a couple of days before this apparent chemical weapons strike on Tuesday. Now the president, in a rare moment of public introspection, is sort of saying, you know, he's a flexible person, but also, you know, and he saw the video and the footage yesterday when he was briefed by his national security team, and that it caused him to change his mind, to turn around on Syria, take a tougher line on Assad, take a tougher line on Russia for backing Assad. His administration is doing now, and I think that, you know, that's a sign that he's growing into the role, and certainly is something that is worth noting, because we've never seen Donald Trump do this, sort of have it engage in this sort of almost self-doubt. Was he wrong to say this publicly even just a week ago?
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how his position continues to evolve. But you referenced this. So Senator Marco Rubio called out Secretary of State Rex Tillerson for his previous comments that the long-term status of Assad should be decided by the Syrian people. Well, later, Secretary Tillerson also commented. Let's take a listen to that.
It's my belief that if you're Bashar al-Assad and you read that it is no longer a priority of the United States to have you removed from power, I believe that is an incentive to act with impunity. I personally do not believe that it's coincidental.
There's no doubt in our mind that the Syrian regime under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad is responsible for this horrific attack. And we think it's time that the Russians really need to think carefully about their continued support of the Assad regime.
So a couple things there, Zeke. It is interesting. You mentioned this timing, right, of this chemical attack, just days after essentially the United States' suggestion was that Assad should remain, and that was something that the United States was not necessarily going to get involved with. But now you have Marco Rubio highlighting the timing of this. First of all, what do you make of Marco Rubio's suggestion that this attack was not a coincidence? And then also Rex Tillerson's latest comments, given that he's actually heading to Moscow next week.
You know, the White House was asked about this yesterday, and they rejected the timing. But certainly, there does seem to be, you know, it is, you know, in a way, really coincidental, if nothing else. You know, obviously, this was not the first chemical weapons attack in Syria, or apparent chemical weapons attack this year, but it was the most significant we've seen in quite a long time. And coming so closely after those comments really does seem to be an indication that the Syrian regime, just like every government around the world, follows every utterance of the U.S. president, the U.S. administration very closely, and they're willing to act on that.
Yeah, and then Rex Tillerson, you know, heading to Moscow next week, he's making it very clear that at least now, the latest position from the Trump administration is that it will not tolerate any kind of involvement that Russia may have with respect to Syria.
Yeah, I mean, that's in a way the latest data point in the evolution we've seen in sort of maybe not President Trump's thinking, but certainly the institution around him. All the various elements of the U.S. government have taken over the last around him have taken over the last 3 months, almost 3 months that he's been in office. We have seen Rex Tillerson and others take a tougher line on Russia. Even the president taking a tougher, you know, sort of a tougher line in support of NATO, a more hawkish line there. We have seen them now, for the first time, really try to turn the screws on the Russian government, which has backed the Assad regime for so long. It really does sort of complete an about face from the president, saying he wants to find a more constructive relationship with Russia, at one point talking about some sort of grand bargain. And now we're seeing, in a way, a lot of a retread of the latter 2 years of the Obama White House in some respects.
Yeah, it really is. All right, we'll continue to keep our eye on that. But let's turn briefly now to health care. The vice president went to the Capitol Tuesday without a deal. He left the Capitol without a deal. House Speaker Paul Ryan, who visited the White House late Wednesday, now says we've got time to figure this out. Do we have a sense, Zeke, where is this headed?
It's really not clear. It almost seems like there are a lot of meetings people are trying to get to a deal when there's really not a lot of buy-in about what that deal should look like. And that's really been the problem within this Republican conference for the last, 3 months, let alone the last 7 years. They don't like Obamacare, but they can't agree on what to do to fix it or replace it with. It's not, they can talk all they want, but the basic fundamentals here are still going to be the same. You have these conservative, arch conservatives on one side, the Freedom Caucus, that want to dramatically roll back things like essential health benefits, even pre-existing conditions in some cases. They or simply just want to write a one sentence bill repealing what was passed 7 years ago. And then you have the moderates who are they like the basics of Obamacare. They want to fix it. They're under political pressure to do something to claim they repealed it. And that's in a way too wide a gap within that Republican conference to ever come up with something. And that's just the House, let alone the Senate.
Right. Yeah, I know it's really difficult to see how all these different sides come together. But I do also want to turn to President Trump's upcoming meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago. The top issues, of course, include trade and North Korea. But what are the administration's priorities there?
Certainly now we have, in light of the North Korean missile launch earlier this week, that's certainly going to be on the top of the agenda. But just like most of President Trump's meetings with foreign leaders so far in his administration, a lot of it's about personal diplomacy. The president is a believer. He's a deal maker, former businessman. That if he's in a room with somebody else, he can come up with some sort of breakthrough that can change the face of U.S. foreign policy. He tried that. We saw him play golf with Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan. We saw him today bring in the King of Jordan, both trading compliments at each other. I think this is going to be a very different sort of meeting. Obviously, the Chinese are not quite looking to give the president some sort of that level of deference in a way. They want to prove themselves on the world stage. Donald Trump also has to prove himself on the world stage. It's going to be it's going to be an interesting dynamic to watch because there's only so much personal relationship that you can build with the Chinese government here.
Yeah, especially after some of the things that President Trump said on the campaign trail. I'm sure the Chinese obviously are well aware of all of that. All right, we'll keep an eye on that as well. Finally, Zeke, also happening Thursday, the showdown over Supreme Court nominee Neil Gorsuch. Bipartisan negotiations in hopes of reaching a deal to avoid the nuclear option have collapsed. So explain the tactic that GOP leaders plan to use Thursday to change the filibuster rule and what's likely to happen there.
It's a multi-part process, and the basics of it come to they're going to lose the vote and then appeal the vote, and then and that appeal takes place on a simple majority vote. So they have 52 votes in the Senate right now. That will allow them to roll back the filibuster essentially on Judge Gorsuch. And the broader thing here is that it doesn't necessarily have to stop at the Supreme Court now. I mean, the Supreme Court was, when Democrats went nuclear, as this is called around Washington, a couple of years ago during the Obama administration, they left it in place for Supreme Court nominees. Once it goes away for the Supreme Court, we can start seeing it go away even for legislation. Republican lawmakers say that at a certain point you have the Senate looking like the House, and it really does sort of heighten the stakes for everything taking place in the Senate. And that's partly why lawmakers on both sides are so worried about triggering this. Why it might be too soon still even yet to write off those negotiations because there is a desire within both parties to find an off ramp here.
Yeah, they certainly seem to be on the brink, though. Zeke Miller, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.